Hello and welcome to this very special event today we have with Funding London. For the second year in a row, we have gathered together three icons of the business world for a discussion on the future of work and how the landscape of business has changed post-pandemic. These men have grown startups in some of the most iconic and valuable companies on the planet today. So this is promising to be a great event. For those of you who don't know them, let's meet them now. We have Sukhendu Pal with us. Sukhendu worked at Oracle for over a decade. Following that, he went on to work for the biggest bank in the world, where he founded a startup business unit, which became a £10 billion business in emerging markets and spanning over 70 countries. So welcome, Sukhendu. We also have Steve Garnett with us today. After a decade at Oracle, Steve went on to co-create two other amazing companies, Siebel Systems and Salesforce, with the founders Tom Siebel and Mark Benioff, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Over the past 4 years, Sukhendu and Steve have mentored the Mayor of London's portfolio of 150 startup companies. So very, very well connected and very well versed in the tech and business world. And finally, we also welcome Stephen Kelly. Hello, Stephen. After a successful run at Oracle, Stephen then led 3 successful turnarounds to growth as a hands-on CEO and growing market value of those businesses by approximately 10 billion. Most recently at Sage, another household name. Stephen is the current chair of Tech Nation, as the only business leader to have run 2 FTSE 100 technology companies. So again, a great mind that we have with us today. I will finally add that between 2015 and 2019, Stephen also served as the Prime Minister's business ambassador. So welcome, Sukhendu, Steve and Stephen, who've also been friends for over 3 decades and share similar values. So it's really good when these guys kind of bounce off each other. So we're all in for a treat today. So this event, is brought to you in partnership with Funding London, who I mentioned earlier, and it's presented by Business Leader and the GoTech Awards 22. So I'm going to start the questions, and I'm going to start with Steve Garnett. But if the other panelists want to kind of chime in and interrupt me, and Steve, please do, and we can have quite a nice kind of conversation. But Steve, like I mentioned earlier, 12 months ago, we were all here around this virtual table. I believe it was actually in August. And it's safe to say that there is still some uncertainty in the business world. And we've heard a lot over the past 12 months about what will change in this post-pandemic world. But rarely do we talk about some of the things that won't change and are going to stay the same. So I'd like to get your insight into what are some of the things in the business that you feel are going to kind of stay regardless of what's going on in the world.
Well, that in itself is a huge topic, of course, because there's enormous numbers of things that aren't going to change. Focus on customer success is not going to change. Being an innovative company is not going to change. Striving to grow your business is not going to change. Being an insurgent for your customer is not going to change. But perhaps, if I had to single out one thing that isn't going to change and never has done, never will do, in my opinion, is that one of the keys to success, one of the cornerstones, is to hire great people around you. I think both Steve and Sukhendu would agree that, a lot of our success is based around having built great teams. If you've got a great team, you can achieve an awful lot. It's probably page 1 of any management book, but it's easy to say, but very hard to do. How do you build great teams? Well, to my mind, the first thing you need to do is to motivate them. How do you motivate great people? You have to have a compelling, and attractive, and exciting, and achievable vision for what you're going to do, what you're going to change, why this is so exciting to be part of. That will attract good people. And that's really important. And once you start attracting good people around your vision, and by all means you should go and question that vision with skeptics and with other business leaders, and have people, naysayers, make you hone in. But when you attract great people, something else happens. You attract other great people. Everybody wants to be part of a good team, and if you do that, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, when you attract great people, you have to keep them. How do you make sure you maintain these great people who you've spent so much time attracting? And it's the old saying that you have to train them so that they can leave, but motivate them so they don't. But how do you do that in practice? And in my experience, you have to be what I would call a door opener. You have to take time with individuals to take interest in their careers. You have to remember that people will do anything for leaders who encourage their dreams, justify their fears, help them when they fail, and support them when they fail. They'll do anything for you. So to take time out, one of the tips quickly we used to do at Salesforce is we'd sit down with people and say, what do you want to be? What's your dream? What's your ambition in this company? Do you want to be a mountain climber? Do you want to be an explorer? Or do you want to be a deep diver, as an example? A deep diver would be maybe somebody who wants to be an expert in, I don't know, cybersecurity. That's okay. If that's really important to the business, we should invest in that person becoming a great cybersecurity individual, as an example. What's the plan to make that happen? If they want to be an explorer, for example, be in spot marketing and then maybe go into sales and then maybe go into run alliances or partnerships, let's look at that. Let's see how we make that happen. Or if they want to be the mountain climber, they want to run a division or ultimately become a CEO, that's okay. Have they got the right skills to do that? And in my experience, if you invest that time, do planning sessions with key individuals, then they're motivated. They'll stay. They're passionate about the business, and then they're not attracted to leave you. So that's probably the key cornerstone I would focus on. That isn't changing and never will change, in my opinion.
No, thank you, Steve. And Stephen, it's interesting. Steve mentioned there, the attracting talent and retaining talent. And one thing that we hear time and time again at Business Leader from leaders is how difficult it's been to kind of motivate and build culture when, you're going through a pandemic. So there's the stresses of that. You've got some staff are at home, some are in the office. How, in your experience and from what you've learned, what would be your advice, building what Steve said there about how you can really, really keep people motivated and build a culture in this current environment?
Yeah, I think, Steve, it's just great to listen to you again, Steve, and you talk so much sense. And what you say is always without ego. And I think probably in the audience today, there's some really smart founders and entrepreneurs. And Steve's so right. It becomes less about you and it becomes about the team you build. And obviously, I'd say, again, probably all three of us would say, there's no tablets of stone that come down from the mountain for doing this stuff. It's a lot of hard work. And I think the pandemic's really, I've witnessed some amazing leadership from business leaders, particularly, who have stepped up and really focused their whole organizations on serving their customers, serving their people, their employees and their colleagues who had a very different experience of what work was like. And obviously, actually, also many business leaders reaching out and supporting NHS frontline workers and doing the right thing and really sharing their values within their businesses that become very evocative and compelling for their employees as well. I think what it would say is, as we sort of emerge from the pandemic, it's unbelievable the level of adaptability that people have shown in terms of working from home. And many of us, Steve, Sukhendu and I, are involved either as directors or chairs of companies or investors. And nearly all the companies have seen a sort of a leap actually in the productivity of their colleagues. And the colleagues have really rallied around spectacularly. So as we emerge, I think it is a time for reflection and to think about what a new norm looks like that actually is in the best interest of your customers and your colleagues, and actually to jettison some of the things that we took as table stakes from the previous environment. And some of this is a bit counterintuitive, because if you had told us, 2-3 years ago, that the older generation, people in their, say, 40s and 50s, would actually want to be based at home, you would have said, no, that's just not real. And actually, it's probably the Gen Zs, millennials, who have probably struggled more around working from home because they haven't had that access to mentoring, the sidebar conversations by, the water cooler, where after a meeting, you can catch up with someone who's got 30 years experience and just kind of get a debrief or some coaching. As well as that, we forget the social life for, the graduates coming into companies, the younger people on a Thursday night. And actually, we are witnesses to this because our relationship was built back in the 80s. And yet we're still today, all these years later, great friends. So this is a time where in your work life, you can build friendships for life as well with people of similar values. And they've missed out on that by working from home and not experiencing that face-to-face human contact. And I think the other factor is, so there's a number of things that would be sort of counterintuitive, whereas we would have said the older generation actually would have struggled with this. They've really embraced it. I talked to lots of people in their 40s and 50s. They would have a strong preference now to sort of in perpetuity work from home. Whereas there is that level of, I guess, love for the younger generation to come back in the office and just have that social contact, that mentoring. And also, I think a factor which is spoken more about now than, when we were in our 20s, but around mental health support and actually mental well-being for employees. And it's tough, it's lucky for us. You look around our home offices, we're very, very fortunate. But if you're living on the 12th floor of a block in Peckham, and you've got a dog running around, you've got young children, it's a lot more of a challenge. So I think the essence of this, Ollie, is it really gives business leaders time to reflect. And it is all about, I think the common theme is it's all about leadership, and the shadow that you cast as a leader sets the tone for your culture within your company. And I do think it's a great time to consult with colleagues to say, what's the most appropriate way we can work together to be the strongest team we can be, to build on the productivity that we've seen from more virtual working, but to also align ourselves around building huge customer value and driving the growth of the company to do what Steve said around the ambition and the vision. But to do that in a really sympathetic, supportive way for our colleagues. And I do think most of the companies that I'm involved in have come out with sort of policies around more hybrid working. And the one thing that I'm sure we'll go on to talk about is it's not a sort of binary relationship between an employee and a company anymore. It's a real bond of trust, because if it's out of sight, out of mind, but amazing things have been achieved with people working from home. And we really want to build on that positivity to say there's a new bond of trust between managers, leaders, and their people, to say, we're really all in this together. We have that common vision. We're clear about the mountain we've got to climb, and we know our individual roles, and they've been defined as to what we want to achieve in 2025 and what that means we've got to hit in terms of the annual plans for this year, this quarter. And we trust ourselves to support each other and make sure that we put the capability in place from our human capital to deliver against the customer value and the growth challenge that we've set ourselves. So I think it is a really refreshing time, and the great leaders that I've witnessed have sort of taken the lessons of what we've learned through the pandemic, but applied it to a new model where it really is embedded in a DNA of fanaticism about customers and a real empathy for their employees and their colleagues.
Thank you, Stephen. A really fascinating insight there. Sukhendu, what would you like to add to this thread?
I think Stephen has already covered most of the things I wanted to cover, but he eloquently articulated the key points that really are relevant over the last 15, 18 months that we experienced.
Us. Okay, yes, Sukhendu. Yes, what I was interested to learn from you. Obviously, what we're seeing is now a bit of a kind of a divide between those who maybe want to kind of continue working in the office and those that don't. And obviously, Stephen mentioned that difference in the kind of age groups and how they're kind of feeling that. What would you say to kind of managements and teams who are trying to get people back to the office, but maybe they're seeing some kind of pushback and how that may be best handled?
This is an interesting topic, and I come across, or I listen to this on a regular basis from the people I speak with. Now, since the dawn of capitalism, people have lamented the world of work, always believing the past was better than the present. Not surprisingly, though, many leaders worry that hybrid work will stop collaboration and cancel culture. But this assumption is based on nostalgic fantasy, lack of trust in employees, and sloppy logic. And this false narrative also obscures the fundamental truth, and that is, when leaders and politicians express concern about hybrid working, that means working from home and remotely, as well as working from office, they're really worried about losing control. And what's more, they forget that working is something you achieve, or work is something you achieve, not somewhere you go. Given the harsh realities of the pandemic, it may feel unnecessary for managers to make compromises to senior leaders' idiosyncrasies. Yet, as we know, keeping senior leaders happy is part of managing up. So managers, for example, can manage this tension and advocate for their teams as long as they do it tactfully. And I stress tactfully. In other words, to flourish in the era of remote working or hybrid working, managers will need the cunning of Machiavelli and the tactical brilliance of Napoleon. And this is how, for example, they could do it in 4 simple steps. First, focus on what your senior leaders care about and find out ways to show that remote work is beneficial to the company, not just to individuals. Second, demonstrate that your team is engaged no matter where they're located. It's location independent. For example, you might invite senior leaders to video meetings that include both in-person and remote workers. Third, encourage employees to treat company senior leaders as the most valued customers. And finally, reach out for HR support. So if managers and middle managers can incorporate these 4 actions into a cohesive program and execute it, they should be able to manage and navigate these tensions effectively.
No, thank you, Sukhendu. Did anyone want to add anything to that segment before we moved on? Steve, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, I agree with Sukhendu. I mean, in days gone by, back to my answer about things that haven't changed. Anybody out there who's run a consulting business or professional services business knew that if you had one of your colleagues on site for any length of time, particularly if they were a junior colleague, and they were, for argument's sake, working on a project at, I don't know, let's call it Barclays, and they were there for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, there was a significant risk that they would then go what they used to call native. They would leave feeling part of your company and start to feel part of the customer's company, and therefore you would lose them. I think that sort of feeling of going native or that lack of loyalty, for argument's sake, will be compounded in the hybrid world, because they're not having those, as Stephen mentioned, those little water cooler chats. They're not bonding with what are going to be lifelong friends who have got similar values. They're maybe not getting together to play sport after work, and on and on and on. And so it makes it even more important, I think, for managers and leaders to be taking more of an interest in individuals' careers and how they're feeling and how they're bonding with your company than ever before.
No, thank you, Steve. I think some interesting points there. Stephen, did you have something to add as well?
Yeah, I did. Actually, a question to Sukhendu. I think I love what Sukhendu says, and the practical advice is really helpful. And if I was, and I'm guessing some of the audience are, entrepreneurs, founders of 10, 20, 30 people companies. So they might not even have like HR departments and stuff set up. What advice could you give them? And I agree with Steve around the practical things they can do to build that culture, that loyalty, that sense of family. Just simple things that you see, I guess, as best practice to avoid going native.
I think what they could do is to have, today we have got a number of electronic means of communication. So even though we may be all working remotely, they can also get onto WhatsApp or WhatsApp, or they can call up or video conferencing. I think it's important that communications are maintained even though there may be 10, 15 people. And in the absence of face-to-face meetings and the rest, we have to find effective alternative so that we keep communicating, keep inspiring each other, and work as a cohesive team, even though it may be a small company. So we have to find other ways to achieve the same goal. And that's I would recommend that, small companies, people in the small companies, they do.
Well, thank you, Sukhendu. An interesting start to debate there on the segment of culture and working from home against working in the office, and how you can kind of keep staff motivated and stop them going native, as kind of Steve mentioned. Before we go on to the next section of questions, just want to add that this discussion is presented by the GoTech Awards. Lots of successful companies enter the GoTech Awards. We just want to have a quick intro video here from Andrew Budd at the CB, the founder and CEO of iProve, who was one of last year's winners, and he's going to tell us more about the impact that's had on his business.
The GoTech Awards are some of the most prestigious awards that this industry can offer, and they are rigorously judged and recognise real quality, and real quality is what iProve aspires to. So this kind of recognition is enormously important, and, if I may say, very gratifying for us.
That was Andrew Budd there from iProve, talking about the impact winning the GoTech Awards has had on his business. Please do go and enter if you're watching this and you're involved in the tech space. Entries are open now, and there's 14 categories that you can choose from. So please do go to the website, which is www.gotechawards.co.uk. Now back to today's session. We're going to come back to yourself, Steve. As I alluded to earlier, we had this conversation 12 months ago, albeit in a slightly different situation. We've pulled a clip from what you said during this event. I just want to get your kind of analysis on that clip. So we'll just play that, and then we'll come back to you.
I think firstly it will be remembered for the tragic loss of life. Perhaps the second thing is the speed and quality of some of the response has clearly been, governmental response has clearly been slow in the light of the overwhelming evidence that we could see coming towards us. That's part of it being disappointing. It's also meant that a lot of companies have had to recalibrate their business models that maybe worked before that will no longer work with social distancing, and might not work for some time. And perhaps the whole life balance has also come to the forefront, where we don't need to commute necessarily for that meeting. The pre-wisdom was that we had to be in that meeting in person, in that room, in London, New York, Los Angeles, or wherever. And I think, like everybody on this call today, perhaps maybe it's, 2 in 10, 3 in 10 that you might need to be physically there as opposed to virtually.
Thank you there. Sukhendu, it's only me and you who have added beards since then. So we all look fresh-faced still. Two things
got older.
Yeah, two things there I want to kind of pick up on, Steve. The first was you mentioned the government's response at the time. You felt it was kind of disappointing. As difficult as the situation is, do you feel that the government's reaction over the past 12 months has done enough to plaster over their shortcomings in the first 6 months, or do you still feel quite critical?
Well, we are where we are, and I think we have to look to the future and to move on. I'm sure there'll be some kind of inquiry that will come up and pull out all the mistakes that were made. That's just the way it is. But I think we're in pretty good shape. I mean, it's great to see the country moving again. I was in London yesterday for a business meeting, and it was very, very busy. It looks like there's a lot of people going back to the office, albeit maybe in a hybrid working environment. But it looks like some of the pre-COVID environment is back with us, and that's got to be good. Hopefully, because of the science and the vaccines and the amazing technology that the biochemists and the chemists have created for us in the vaccines, we're not going to go back down any sort of lockdown. It seems to me that the risk is, maybe it's a bit political to say so, but it seems to me that the pandemic is over, but the pandemic is in the anti-vaxxers at the moment. It certainly looks like, from the statistics I see, that 97% of people who are hospitalized are people who refuse to have the vaccine. So it seems to me that we've made fantastic progress in science and logic here, and that all bodes well for business.
No, thanks, Steve. No, it's interesting you mentioned that point there about the vaccination. Obviously, we were, in a completely different place when we spoke last year, and the impact that's had has been quite telling, hasn't it? I also just want to briefly pick up, you mentioned there about home-life balance. And do you believe 12 months later that there's been a reset and people are now managing to kind of manage that better and not kind of working too many hours when they're at home?
Yeah, I think they have, actually, and what was surprising to me, when I think it was last April time, when I think there was a front page of The Economist, which you had the front page of The Economist had a picture of the globe with closed across it. It looked pretty scary for business, right? Just about every country had been locked down. What was counterintuitive was productivity went up in a lot of companies, and that meant, what does that mean? It meant that we got more done by not potentially spending 3 or 4 hours commuting, or spending a day visiting that one customer, where the customer might well have been happy to do it on a Zoom call. The conventional wisdom pre-pandemic, of course, was if it was a large contract, or you were meeting a senior executive at your customer, you better show up. And it'd be deemed disrespectful not to show up. I wish I had a few pounds for all the meetings I've gone to, which post-pandemic I probably could have done using this forum and not been on an aeroplane or a train or a car. So there's no doubt there's a new way of working, and I'm sure we're still learning some of the balance, as we discussed on before, about going native when you don't have those contacts with your colleagues, and at the same time being more productive when you don't have to travel into the office. There's some counterbalance to have there. We probably don't totally understand all of those dynamics yet, but it's to answer your question, Ollie, I think we're certainly getting there.
No, thanks, Steve. Really interesting. And Sukhendu, it's your turn now. We're going to retrospectively go back and hear about something you said, and be great to get your kind of take on it now.
This is a huge challenge in normal time, never mind in the new normal environment. Leaders will have their work cut out. They will need to over-communicate to keep their teams engaged. They will need to make sure that their communications are completely free of ambiguity, so that all employees, many of whom are working remotely, can focus on the work they're doing rather than speculating or worrying about what the boss is thinking. You see, culture is invisible during good times, but in a crisis like this one, its presence can be seen clearly in the collective behaviors that either help a company pull together and get things done, or lead to inertia, confusion, or even mistrust.
Yeah, cheers for that, Sukhendu. It's really interesting what you said there about culture is invisible during the good times. It's really interesting, evergreen kind of takeaway there. I just want to get your thoughts 12 months on, and from what you said there.
I can't remember what I said 12 days ago, never mind 12 months ago. But thank you for reminding us what I said 12 months ago. My observations, since then, have led me to believe that just as individuals can learn to develop personal traits of resilience, so too can companies develop a culture of resilience. Here are how some companies, startups that we mentored, have employed resiliency traits at the organizational level. For example, in the last 12 months. First, they invested in their client base. Second, they innovated at times of adversity. Third, they invested in their leaders, as well as in all levels of their workforce. To say we live in a challenging times, is an understatement. But this pandemic also provided companies with opportunity to build a resilience culture. So my takeaway is companies who cultivated a resilience culture during this pandemic are better positioned to prosper today when others have faltered during this time.
No, thank you, Sukhendu. Steve or Stephen, did you want to add anything before we moved on? Stephen, yeah, please.
Yes, Sukhendu, you're so right. And resilience, there's just something that actually, as a thread, we could share to leaders out there. And it's back to your question, Steve, about what did we learn from, I guess, the 18 months of the pandemic in terms of how to deal with it? Obviously, it's a massively complex situation, but in our business life as leaders, we hit crisis. And the crisis could be we're running out of money, we can't make payroll, we have a cyber attack on the company, or we lose our biggest customer, or we lose our, chief revenue officer or whatever. So there are crisis moments, and probably our lessons from our collective experience would be two kind of things for the founder, the CEO to do. One is kind of never dither. You've got to hit the emergency button and plan for the worst. Hope for the best, but plan for the worst, and come up really rapidly with a coherent plan. And that's back to Sukhendu's advice around being innovative, come for creative thinking, particularly if you're running out of money. Is there other ways you can fund the business to carry on? And the second thing, which I think is so important for business leaders and is often said but rarely done, is we apply sort of lessons learned. And we manage out of the crisis, we get to a steady state, and normally we have amnesia about that situation, and then 6 months later it happens again. And as business leaders, I do think it's really helpful to do the lessons learned, and then what changes do we need to make to the culture, the processes, systems, training, whatever it is that's relevant. And I just, for Stephen, Sukhendu, maybe ask you, in those moments of crisis that business leaders faces, what are the practical advice we can give them?
I think it's the old, if I can chime in, it's the old adage of, in times of good, you lead from the back, and in times of challenge, you lead from the front. And so when you see challenges like we've had at COVID, I would hope, and what I've seen is that good leaders have been out there at the front, encouraging, communicating, keeping in contact with their customers and with their employees, over communicating, you could argue, but I don't think that perhaps there is such a thing in times of crisis. When everything's going great, not that it often going great, then you can take a lesser role. But being out there and addressing the challenges, listening to people's fears, holding town hall meetings, allowing people to ask open questions and not be afraid to ask the leader, and not be afraid to put their hand up and ask what they may perceive as dumb questions, or maybe challenge, or maybe politically incorrect questions, perhaps. They should be able to do that. One of the successes I felt we did at building the culture at Salesforce in the early days was no question was ruled out of order. And if Mark Benioff or I or whoever was standing up and talking about the business, we encouraged people to ask whatever questions, whatever fears or uncertainties they had on their mind, and we'd try and bet, even if they weren't terribly complimentary to the latest management decision. That's okay. They can hear that view, and be open and honest. I think gets you a long way.
Thank you, Steve. Sukhendu, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I will say, the golden rule would be to listen, because that's how senior leaders or founders or startup CEOs, they're going to find out what the real issues are and then act on them. But again, acting on them doesn't mean they have to go and decide for themselves, because most of the CEOs, they don't have answers to everything. So they should ask, this is the situation we are in, these are the problems we are facing, so what should we do? And often in a situation like these, people will come forward with ideas, and often CEOs, probably never heard of those ideas or never thought about those ideas. So it's listening, and then acting on it, but again, through listening is what I think the right way to go ahead when facing a situation like the pandemic we have faced for the last 18 months or so.
Thank you.
I'd like to add one final thing on Sukhendu's comments, which I totally agree with, is that one of the most common mistakes I find with new CEOs or with new leaders is that they believe they need to show that they know the answers all the time, because they're the CEO. They're supposed to have all the answers. They're the leader. They're supposed to know exactly which direction. The great leaders I've come across actually turn around and say, I don't know. In fact, this is a very interesting challenge. I've got no idea which way to go. Let's think, let's discuss it. Let's get the issue out on the table. Then let's make a decision. Sure, they're decisive, but it's totally legitimate to put your hand up and say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
No, thanks, Steve, for that, and some really good practical tips there, which I think our listeners can kind of take away. Stephen, you might have noticed a theme that we're playing a video from last year. So here's yours, and a snippet of what will the pandemic be remembered for. And I just want to come back and ask you a quick question, if that's okay.
Sure. There's a couple of things, and we're having a chat over dinner with my kids and their friends, and we grew up in a generation that were massively impacted by the Second World War and then rationing, and it changed their behaviors about hoarding food, making sure food was never thrown away. It's amazing, even 30-40 years later, and I'm sure the impact of the lockdown and the pandemic will have a lasting effect on people's behavior.
Thanks, Stephen. A really interesting point there. I just want to talk about mental health and employees and just get your take on, 12 months later, how do you think things are changing in this space? Any practical advice you could give to some of our listeners about how they can, implement policies that benefit the mental health of their staff?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits, actually, one of the good things to come out of the pandemic is just there's so much more talked about regarding mental health and well-being, and that balance that we got to have of good physical and mental health, to be the best version of ourselves, really. And that goes for everybody, founders, CEOs, from receptionists to throughout the organization. So I definitely have seen almost actually what Steve said, great leaders. You can't have all the answers on this, and it's such a complex area, and every individual employee is different and has come from a different set of contexts. So what I've seen recently, actually, in the last 3 or 4 months, is good leaders stepping in, expressing their own vulnerabilities, and actually getting some of their trusted colleagues together to think about what does the new world need to look like for the company to get the best out of our people. And actually that could be a number of things that around hybrid work in some sort of policy, and you've sort of 2 days, 3 days, but it also has then massive spin-off benefits around one of the areas, actually, just to pick one, is around co-parenting. So again, 30 years ago, some of these conversations never happened, and you just fell into sort of stereotypes. Whereas now, I think there's a lot more thoughtful conversation around, what makes kind of most sense, whose career can we take a pause button on? Could we go back and support each other as a kind of unit? And how do we get the best out of both us and manage that work-life balance, but also progress in our respective careers? So I think there's a lot to be said there. And I think I would encourage leaders to really be open about having those conversations and not fear really anything. Because again, the level of trust that I've seen from the employees and colleagues has been exemplary, and they've always sought to do the right thing for the customers. A lot of them have gone off and done volunteering. A lot of them are, issuing the vaccine at sort of pop-up vaccine centers. It's just amazing, the outpouring of positivity and goodwill that we've seen from employers, and we kind of want to harness that and bottle it and build a culture where we go forward together in a high growth environment. And I just think it is a time where leaders can really tap into that. And as Steve said, fun over community, but now it's the time probably where things are going better. And a lot of tech companies out there have really had a stellar last year in terms of financial performance and growth. The leaders kind of stepping back and listening to Sukhendu's point, being more consultative, more reflective, and then really shaping the policies and the strategy to be very successful and very centered around the things that Steve started off talking about around customer obsession, but also supporting employee well-being. So I've seen many examples of things like mentoring programs coming in, actually one other thing, sort of mental first aiders being trained to support colleagues, just to watch for signals where people become vulnerable or just might be entering a period of depression, and just a whole load of support to make the companies that they're part of a real living dynamic where it's very supportive. And, you know, the rhetoric that the chief executive says is really matched by what happens on a day-to-day basis, the sort of say-do gap. We say this, we're a compassionate employer, we sort of support our employees, and when the rubber hits the road and someone goes off signed off for 2 weeks because they've got depression or they're sick or they're unwell or they've got childcare issues, then how does the company react in those moments to support them and show that compassion on a day-to-day basis? And I've seen more of that, and I think actually there's a real potential for it to be a much more supportive, engaging workplace. And the final two things I'll say, actually, you know, just to throw it open, is we are going to see a war for talent like we've never seen before. And obviously, you know, we can now hire developers easily in Romania or South America. But actually, you know, it's again, easy to say that, and it's a lot harder to do that and build that culture and build that cohesive company culture where you're going to shoot for the stars. But the reality is there's a war for talent now in all the key roles I'm involved in, whether it's developers or great sales leaders or great product marketing people, management people. You know, there's a real dearth of talent. And I think there's been a shift now, and we'll see this in some wage inflation that's coming into the tech marketplace, where actually the sort of supply and demand of talent has kind of shifted a gear. The other thing that's an important factor just to keep an eye on, particularly with all the things like COP26 coming up at the end of the year, you know, companies will be asked to think about much more sustainability, achieving net zero, the race to zero, and climate change, and embed that within their company culture. And again, you know, what a golden opportunity. I'll give you just a tried example, a CFO who actually took the initiative and said, we're not going to go back to the old way of flying around on 747s. We're going to use the learnings from the pandemic to say, actually, on internal meetings, no flights. You do it on Zoom or you do it on Teams. You only, and actually, to Steve's point, you don't fly to America to see one customer because the customers get it too. And you know, the planet's burning, as we're seeing out in Greece or we're seeing in Vancouver. And I think there's another massive global emergency emerging out of the pandemic, which is the climate change emergency. And we can play a really critical role in being part of the solution for that as business leaders. So, and that does affect the way we operate, how much we travel, the carbon footprint we create. So I think there's a lot of complexity here, but it's a real unique opportunity for leadership to step forward and lead in the right way.
Thank you for that, Stephen. We've got one more question which we're going to cover before we close, but just wanted to bring that up now. So we talked about kind of customer success earlier, and you know, a lot of people say they put the customer at the heart of their company. We just want to get some kind of practical tips for what you can really do to actually, you know, do that and not just pay lip service to it. I don't know if Steve, if you want us to kind of start with that.
Yeah, I'll kick it off if I may. It was something that I'm passionate about. It was something that of the values when we were building Salesforce, when we had a handful of people there when I first went there, and it's now, I think, 60,000 people. One of the core values that we always came out with at the end of our executive meeting was customer success. But customer success it's not a strap line. It's not something that is written in the annual report or on the website or is in the foyer of the head office. It's something that has to be part of your vision. It has to be part of your core values. And then you have to say, so how are we going to achieve that? What are the things that we will do in our business that will make the customers successful. And how do we map that out so it becomes part of the culture? So there may be 10 or 20 processes that you have to do each year that makes the customer successful. And so the culture then starts to come around, that there's executives measured on it, there's people measured on it, they get rewarded or not, as the case may be, depending on the customer success. You have people constantly checking both the customer success, you check how easy it is to buy from you, the whole process from being a prospect through to being a valued and long-term customer, checking each of those processes. There'll be people doing that. There'll be people being measured on it. There'll be executives measured on it. It'll be something that's discussed at every executive meeting. How well are our customers doing? How many customers have left us? Why did they leave us? Could we have prevented it? What did we do wrong? Why did they leave us? And on and on and on. This could be a several-hour topic, several-day topic in itself. But you basically have to build those processes inside the company, staff it accordingly, whereby eventually the culture becomes: should I make that sales call, that new sales call, which looks really great, or should I go and fix a customer problem? You go and fix the customer problem. And that's the ultimate culture that then starts to generate around it, that nobody will ever be penalized inside of the company for going to help the customer succeed. And that's the environment that you want people to grow in. And as I say, it needs to be a well-defined, well-executed, well-measured process inside the business.
Thanks, Steve. Some really, really good advice there. Sukhendu, is there anything you wanted to add?
Steve, I will add a few things. There are host of processes, as Steve outlined, needs to be implemented in order to put customers at the heart of the business. But I would say that you can do it in a very simple way. For example, companies who want to put customers at the heart of their business, they need to care about their own employees first. Just because if you're not successful in taking care of your own employees, you are unlikely to be successful putting customers at the heart of your business. So that's number one. Number two, it is vitally important that you clearly define customer service and customer success, because those are two different things. And it's important to define them clearly so that employees can understand the difference between these two. And also use customer success stories, for example, to celebrate and inspire within the company as well as outside the company. And to create 300, what in the industry we call 360-degree views of the customers within the company. And finally, allow customer service to shape your sales and marketing effort. So these are the, for example, 5 hows which companies can use to put customer success in the middle or the core of their business.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And obviously, as Steve mentioned, this is all these subjects we could talk about for hours a day. I just want to end by just saying, if we could all just have a final word and just one final piece of advice for as business leaders and their staff return to the office, one kind of takeaway that we could give them. Stephen, if we start with you.
Steve said, there's some really practical ways to lead you and bring customers to the heart of your business. So when I ran all hands meetings, I invited customers to come along and present about what they did. When I went out, I had a clear list of who I needed to spend time to in terms of my priorities as CEO, and all the stakeholders, customers, partners, employees, shareholders, the community, government, regulators, all these sort of folks, and customers. I had to shift gears and make sure they're top of mind. So they're very generous customers as well, and they share that mutual success bond. And what great looks like is when you go on the website of the company and the shop window, and it's all about customers and how you solve their problems. So just going out as a CEO, taking videos with your iPhone or Samsung, post them on social media, just make sure that message comes from the very top, that customers are not only who they pay their wages, but we're there to let them achieve their dreams, and embed that in everything. Have your board meetings at their premises, all the simple things you can do to really embed them as part of the fabric of your company. And if you do that, you're going to be hugely successful.
No, thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate your time today as well. We'll now come on to Sukhendu. So a final word from yourself, Sukhendu.
So I view, because we talked about future of work really for the last 45, 50 minutes. I view the future of work, in the post-pandemic era as a combination of three symbiotic elements or three W's. And those three W's are work, workforce, and workplace. So to adequately prepare for future of work, for example, companies will need to fully understand the nature of work they do, who is needed to perform that work, and finally, where that work to be done. And getting this right will eventually determine the winners in the post-pandemic world.
And thank you, Sukhendu, and thank you very much for your time and knowledge today. And Steve, thanks again, and nice to see you again a year on. A final thought from yourself.
Yeah, two, if I may. I quickly want to back up what Stephen said on customer success. The one thing that perhaps we didn't say and is absolutely true is that when you get customer success, they do three things for you. The customer will buy more from you. They'll recommend you to friends, family, and colleagues in the industry. And then when they move on from their current position to another one, they'll buy from you again. So they are by far your best salespeople, just in case you didn't know. My final point would be, in this, as Stephen touched on, in this war on talent, I think he called it, which I totally agree. If you have that great team, or you're building that great team that I discussed at the start of this call, then you need to invest that time in them. So if you haven't already done so, go back, put planning sessions in for the individuals that you consider great. Because, I had door openers for me. I had the Jeff Squires, the Ray Lanes, the Mark Benioffs who opened doors for me. Sure, they paid me a good salary, but that wasn't the main thing. They took time to look at where I wanted to be, what I needed to develop, and they took that time, and that's why I never left those companies until the time was absolutely right. So if you're out there and you're a leader and you've got a great team around you, and you're not spending individual private time with those your key people, please do spend the time, invest in them where they want to be in 18 months' time, what success looks like for them as their career. If you do that, you'll get massively loyal employees who will do anything for you.
No, thank you, Steve. Some really, really sound advice. And thanks again to our three guests for their time, and also to Funding London for partnering with us for today's event. Be sure to submit your GoTech Awards entry before the 1st of October if you feel it's relevant to you. And don't forget to catch up on previous interviews and live events by visiting the Business Leader website. Thank you.